The silence that fell across Germany in May 1945 was not peaceful. It was the silence of exhaustion. The industrial heart of the Third Reich, the Ruhr, lay in twisted iron ruin, a landscape of skeletal girders and crushed masonry. The Luftwaffe's airfields were graveyards of aluminium and ash, populated by the shattered remains of a force that had once terrified Europe. But amidst the rubble of the thousand-year Reich, a different kind of warfare had already begun. It was not fought with artillery barrages or armoured spearheads, but with recovery teams, technical intelligence officers, and flatbed railway trucks. The Allies, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, were ostensibly united in victory, yet already divided by deep, corrosive suspicion. Each power understood a singular, terrifying truth. The Germans, despite their strategic incompetence and logistical collapse, had produced engineering anomalies that were a generation ahead of Allied equivalents. The race to secure this intellectual and physical capital, the Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons, would dictate the balance of power for the next half-century. This was a covert war of specialized units, a frantic scavenger hunt played out across a broken continent. The Americans deployed the Alsos mission and the T-forces, armed with black lists of specific scientists and hardware prototypes. They operated with a frantic urgency, often pushing deep into territory designated for Soviet occupation under the Yalta agreements, racing to snatch prizes before the Red Army arrived. In the Harz Mountains, American recovery teams engaged in a logistical sprint, loading V-2 components onto rail cars, while the rumble of Soviet artillery grew louder in the east. It was a chaotic free-for-all, where international treaties were bent and broken by the immediate hunger for technology. This was not merely a matter of capturing scientists. That narrative is well trodden. This is the story of the hardware itself. The fate of the airframes, the guidance gyroscopes, the hydrogen peroxide turbines, and the deadly chemical stockpiles that survived the unconditional surrender. It was a forensic looting of a nation's intellect. While the superpowers dominated the hall, grabbing the headline items, smaller nations gleaned scraps that would fuel their own distinct ambitions. France, largely shut out of the spoils by the Big Three at Yalta, operated with desperate ingenuity. French intelligence agents, scouring the French occupation zone in the southwest of Germany, managed to secure key components of V-2 guidance systems and a handful of German technicians who had slipped through the American and Soviet dragnets. These scraps became the foundation of the Laboratoire de Recherches Balistiques et Aérodynamiques. It was here, built upon the rusted remnants of German ambition, that the French space program was born. The Véronique rocket, which first flew in 1950, was the direct mechanical stepchild of this scavenging effort, proving that even the crumbs of the Wunderwaffen table were enough to build a modern military industry. The primary prize was the Aggregate 4, known to the world as the V-2. By 1945, the V-2 had proven itself strategically negligible, but technologically revolutionary. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a 14-meter totem of terror capable of supersonic impact. It was a weapon that cost more to produce than the Allied Manhattan Project, yet killed fewer people than the slave labor used to build it. When the U.S. 3rd Armored Division entered the Mittelwerk facility near Nordhausen in April 1945, they found the production lines intact. Buried deep within the Kohnstein Hill, shielded from Allied bombers by megatons of rock, sat the future of rocketry. The tunnels were damp, smelling of oil, excrement, and death, a testament to the horrific conditions of the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp inmates who had assembled the weapons. The Americans, fully aware that this territory was contractually assigned to the Soviet occupation zone, moved with industrial haste. Operation Paperclip is famous for the men it secured, Werner von Braun and his inner circle. But the logistical feat of the hardware recovery was equally immense. Under the direction of Colonel Holger Toftoy, Special Mission V-2 was established. The order was simple: strip it bare. In 9 frantic days, American ordnance troops gutted Mittelwerk. They requisitioned 341 railway wagons, overloading the local rail infrastructure to its breaking point. They did not just take completed rockets, they took the production line. Turbopumps, combustion chambers, graphite rudders, and the critical guidance potentiometers were crated and shipped to Antwerp. From there, they crossed the Atlantic to New Orleans, finally arriving by rail at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. They extracted enough materiel to construct 100 operational V2s. When the Soviets arrived at Mittelwerk on the 5th of July, they found the facility swept clean. They were left with the scraps, rejected fuselages, damaged tooling, and parts that had failed quality control. Yet the Soviet hunger for this technology was insatiable. They did not merely copy, they rebuilt the entire industrial ecosystem. Under the command of General Lev Gaidukov, the Soviets rounded up thousands of lower-level German technicians who had not been whisked away by the Americans. Men who understood the welding, the wiring, and the assembly. These men, along with their families and tons of machinery, were transported deep into Russia to Gorodomlia Island on Lake Seliger. It was a gilded cage, a prison of science isolated by water and forests. Here, German engineer Helmut Grötrup led a shadow design bureau. While Sergei Korolev and the Soviet engineers gleaned what they could, the Germans were forced to reconstruct the V2 from memory and scraps. The result was the R-1 missile, which entered service in the Soviet military in 1950. It was not a derivative, it was a near-exact clone, built with captured German machine tools, burning alcohol and liquid oxygen. But the Soviet evolution was rapid. Using the calculations provided by the Germans at Gorodomlia, the Soviets developed the R-2 and eventually the R-5. They solved the V-2's greatest weakness, the structural integrity of the fuel tanks, by integrating the tanks into the fuselage itself, saving weight and increasing range. The road to the R-7's Semyorka, the rocket that would launch Sputnik, was paved with the technical labor of the men from Nordhausen. While the Americans shipped their loot to the desert and the Soviets quietly rebuilt Nordhausen's capability, the British took a different, more pragmatic approach. They wanted to know how to fire the weapon, here and now, in European conditions. This initiative was codenamed Operation Backfire. In October 1945, at a windy, desolate gunnery range near Cuxhaven on the North Sea coast, the British Army assembled the remnants of the German rocket troops. It was a surreal tableau. German crews wearing their Wehrmacht field grey uniforms, stripped of swastika insignia but still bearing the cut of the enemy, worked under the watchful, cold gaze of British technical officers. They were tasked with assembling and launching V2s using mobile launch tables, just as they had done in the terror campaigns against London and Antwerp. The British goal was strictly forensic. They needed to understand the handling qualities of the liquid oxygen fueling process, a substance that boiled at -183 degrees Celsius and froze flesh on contact. They needed to chart the specific ballistics of the ascent phase. 3 rockets were launched, on the 2nd, 4th, and 15th of October. The results were sobering. The V2 was a maintenance nightmare. The graphite steering vanes in the exhaust plume degraded rapidly. The turbopumps, pushing fuel at 5,800 RPM, were prone to catastrophic seizure if the fuel mixture was off by even a fraction. The Cuxhaven trials confirmed that while the V2 was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, it was a failure as a precision weapon. Its circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of rounds would land, was nearly 17 kilometers. It was a terror weapon, not a tactical one. Following the trials, the British dumped much of the remaining heavy equipment into the North Sea, judging the cost of transport to the UK prohibitive. They had the data, the hardware was expendable. In the blinding white gypsum dunes of the New Mexico desert, the surviving German V2s began their second life under the auspices of the US Army's Project Hermes. This was not a smooth transition. Early American attempts to launch the captured hardware were plagued by failures. Gyroscopes drifted, Fuel lines ruptured, and rockets tumbled out of the sky. It was a painful, expensive education in the complexity of liquid fuel rocketry. However, once mastered, these weapons facilitated the bumper program. American engineers, realizing the V-2 struggled to reach extreme altitudes on its own, mated it with a smaller American sounding rocket, the WAC Corporal. The V-2 acted as the first stage, lifting the assembly out of the dense lower atmosphere before the WAC Corporal ignited to punch into the void. On 24 February 1949, Bumper 5 roared off the pad at White Sands. It achieved a velocity of 5,150 miles per hour and reached an altitude of 244 miles. For the first time, a man-made object had truly entered extraterrestrial space. The hardware that achieved this feat was not gleaming new American technology. It was a repurposed German weapon of war, still bearing the manufacturing stamps of the Mittelwerk slave factories. The lineage is undeniable. The V-2 led to the Redstone, which carried the first American into space. The engine clustering concepts developed by the Germans for the proposed A-10 rocket were eventually realized in the Saturn I. The colossal Saturn V, which took humanity to the moon, shares a direct engineering ancestry with the vengeance weapons built in the slave tunnels of 1944. If the V-2 was the star of the post-war intelligence hall, the German jet aircraft were the dark horses. The Allies had jets, the British Gloucester Meteor was operational, but the German Messerschmitt Me-262 and the Arado AR-234 bomber possessed superior aerodynamics. Specifically, they utilized swept wings, a feature Allied designers had largely ignored. Technical intelligence teams, such as the Royal Navy's Eric Brown missions and the US Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe secret technology, combed the airfields of Lechfeld and Lager Lechfeld. They found hundreds of Me-262s sitting on the tarmac, pristine but grounded. The problem wasn't the airframe, it was the engines. The Junkers UMO 004 axial flow turbojet was a marvel of design, but a disaster of metallurgy. Germany had critically lacked nickel and chromium, essential for heat-resistant superalloys. Consequently, the UMO 004 used mild steel protected by a sprayed aluminium coating. The service life of these engines was terrifyingly short, often between 10 and 25 hours before the turbine blades would creep, deform, or disintegrate. The Allied obsession with the Me-262 was rooted in physics. At high speeds approaching the speed of sound, straight wings encounter compressibility. The air builds up in front of the wing, creating shock waves that cause severe drag and loss of control, a phenomenon pilots called hitting the wall. German wind tunnel data revealed that sweeping the wing back delayed the onset of these shock waves. It allowed the aircraft to slice through the air rather than bludgeon it. This was the secret the Allies had missed. When Boeing engineers, led by George Scherer, reviewed the data from the German facility at Völkenrode, they were stunned. They immediately redesigned the B-47 Stratojet, sweeping the wings back to 35 degrees. Every modern jet airliner that crosses the Atlantic today, with its swept wings and podded engines, owes its silhouette to the dusty files recovered from Völkenrode. The British High-Speed Flight Unit at Farnborough received several Me-262s. Captain Eric Brown, the Royal Navy's premier test pilot, flew them extensively. His reports were clinical. He noted that the Me-262 was overwhelming in a dive, superior to the Meteor in raw speed, but a death trap during takeoff and landing. The throttle response was dangerously slow. If a pilot slammed the throttle forward, the engine would flood and flame out, turning the aircraft into a heavy glider. This knowledge fed directly into the development of the de Havilland Vampire and the Hawker Hunter. Rolls-Royce, having acquired the axial flow data from the German BMW and Jumo engines, combined it with their own superior metallurgy to create the Avon engine, a powerhouse that would define British aviation for decades. In the US, The Arado AR-234 bomber influenced the development of the ex-B-43 Jetmaster and the B-45 Tornado. The Arado's use of podded engines and reconnaissance cameras proved that the jet engine was not just for fighters. It could power a strategic bombing fleet. The most immediate safety innovation taken from the German Luftwaffe was the ejection seat. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe realized that bailing out of a jet at 500 miles per hour was physically impossible. The wind blast would pin the pilot to the fuselage. The Heinkel HE-162 Volksjäger and the HE-219 Uhu night fighter were equipped with compressed air ejection seats. The British firm Martin Baker, led by the dogged engineer James Martin, acquired the German schematics. They saw the flaw in the German design. Compressed air was too unpredictable. However, the concept of the guide rail and the explosive charge was sound. Martin Baker refined the German mechanics, replacing the compressed air with a pyrotechnic cartridge. In 1946, the first live test of a Martin Baker seat was conducted by an Irishman named Benny Lynch. He ejected from a Gloucester Meteor at 8,000 feet. It worked. The thousands of lives saved by ejection seats in the subsequent decades are a direct legacy of the desperate safety measures implemented by a crumbling Luftwaffe. While rockets and jets captured the imagination, a more visceral revolution had occurred in the mud of the Eastern Front. The Germans had introduced the Sturmgewehr 44, STG-44, the world's first true assault rifle. It bridged the gap between the long-range bolt-action rifle and the short-range submachine gun, firing an intermediate cartridge that offered controllable automatic fire. By 1945, nearly 500,000 of these weapons had been produced. The Allies were slow to appreciate the concept, but the Soviets were not. They had been on the receiving end of the STG-44 and understood its brutal effectiveness. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet NKVD rounded up the design team from the Henel factory in Suhl, Germany. Among them was Hugo Schmeisser, the lead designer of the STG-44. In October 1946, Schmeisser and 16 of his colleagues were forcibly transported to Izhevsk in the Ural Mountains, the heart of Soviet small arms production. Schmeisser worked in Izhevsk until 1952. During this exact period, a young Russian tank mechanic named Mikhail Kalashnikov was finalizing the design of the AK-47. The extent of Schmeisser's influence on the AK-47 remains a subject of fierce, often nationalistic debate. The internal mechanisms of the two rifles are different. The AK uses a rotating bolt, while the STG uses a tilting bolt. However, the external layout, the gas system concepts, and the manufacturing technique of stamped steel receivers show a clear lineage. The Soviets denied any German input for decades, creating the myth of the lone genius Kalashnikov. But the timeline is inescapable. Schmeisser was in the same factory complex, working on the same problems, at the same time the AK-47 was born. When Schmeisser was finally allowed to return to Germany in 1952, he died shortly after, his specific contributions buried in the archives of the KGB. Yet every time an assault rifle is raised in conflict today, from the M16 to the AK-74, it is following the doctrine laid down by the weapon Schmeisser built for the Wehrmacht. A largely forgotten chapter of the post-war scavenger hunt involves the helicopter. While the American Sikorsky R-4 saw limited service, Germany was arguably ahead in heavy-lift rotorcraft. The Fokker Achilles FA-223 Drache was a twin-rotor beast, capable of lifting cargo that no Allied helicopter could touch. In September 1945, the British conducted a daring recovery operation. They located a surviving FA-223 in Austria. A German Luftwaffe pilot, Helmut Gerstenhauer, was ordered to fly it across the English Channel to the Airborne Forces experimental establishment at Beaulieu. This was the first helicopter crossing of the English Channel in history. The FA-223 was flown until it crashed in October 1945 due to mechanical failure. However, the wreckage and the blueprints were pored over by British engineers. The twin-rotor configuration directly influenced the design of the Bristol Belvedere, which served the RAF into the 1960s. The Soviets, too, captured complete FA-223 airframes. The Mil Design Bureau, which would go on to build the massive Mi-series helicopters that defined Soviet air mobility, like the Mi-8 and the Hind, studied the German transmission systems extensively. The ability of the FA-223 to lift heavy artillery pieces was a capability the Soviets coveted. The DNA of these clumsy early German birds can be found in the heavy lift doctrine that became a hallmark of Soviet Cold War strategy. The Type 21 U-boat, known as the Electroboot, was a paradigm shift. Unlike previous submarines, which were surface ships that could dive, the Type 21 was designed to stay submerged. Its hull was streamlined, lacking deck guns, and it carried massive battery capacity. It featured a hydraulic loading system for torpedoes, capable of reloading in 20 minutes, and a sophisticated passive sonar array that allowed it to fire blindly. At war's end, the surviving fleet was carved up. The Royal Navy took U-3017 and U-2518 for trials in the Bay of Biscay. The results were terrifying. The Type 21 could move silently at 16 knots submerged. This led to the Streamline modification program for British T-class boats. The US Navy took U-2513, using its hull data to design the Guppy upgrades, and eventually the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine. The teardrop hull of modern nuclear subs is the ultimate evolution of the streamlined casing first welded together in Hamburg. However, the most significant transfer of power occurred in the East. The Soviet Union received 4 Type 21s. They did not just study them, they mass-produced a derivative. The Project 613 submarine, known to NATO as the Whiskey class, was the direct offspring of the Type 21. The Soviets built over 200 of these vessels. Utilizing German engineers captured near the Danzig shipyards, the Soviets flooded the world's oceans with these quiet, diesel-electric hunters. For the first 2 decades of the Cold War, the primary underwater threat to NATO convoys was a fleet of submarines that were, in essence, German U-boats flying the hammer and sickle. The most poignant fate belongs to U-2540. Scuttled in 1945, it was raised by the West German Navy in 1957. Refitted as the research vessel Wilhelm Bauer, it served until 1982. It was used to test the acoustic properties of new hull coatings and wire-guided torpedoes. The data gathered by this resurrected ghost ship was instrumental in the design of the modern Type 206 and Type 212 submarines, vessels that are arguably the finest non-nuclear submarines in the world today. Before the V2, there was the V1, Doodlebug. While crude, its afterlife was potent. The US Navy reverse-engineered the V1 as the JB-2, Loon. They tested launching these pulse-jet missiles from the decks of submarines, the USS Cusk and USS Carbonero. This was the birth of the Naval Cruise Missile. The concept of a submarine surfacing to unleash a barrage of guided missiles against a land target, a tactic now synonymous with the Tomahawk, began with American sailors handling German pulse jets in the Pacific surf. While the V1 was a blunt instrument, the Fritz X was a surgeon's scalpel. It was the world's first precision-guided anti-ship glide bomb. Controlled by a joystick-operated radio link, it allowed a bomber crew to steer the weapon in flight. In 1943, it sank the Italian battleship Roma and crippled the British HMS Warspite. Post-war, the Allies were desperate to understand this guidance loop. The US Army Air Forces studied captured Fritz X casings at Wright Field. The manual Kehl Strasbourg radio control system was primitive by modern standards, yet it established the foundational doctrine of modern warfare, that a munition should adjust its trajectory after release. The direct lineage of the Fritz X is found in the laser-guided paveway bombs of Vietnam and the GPS-guided JDAMs of the 21st century. Even the loitering munitions and precision drones currently reshaping battlefields in Eastern Europe operate on the same tactical principle first demonstrated by the Luftwaffe over the Mediterranean. Buried under the chalk hills of Mittelwerk in France lay the most ambitious of the vengeance weapons, the V3 high-pressure pump. It was a multi-chambered supergun designed to bombard London from across the Channel with 600 shells an hour. The 130-metre barrels featured side chambers that would fire sequentially, accelerating the projectile to hypersonic speeds. The site was obliterated by Allied tall-boy earthquake bombs before it could fire a shot in anger. However, the ruins were meticulously studied by British engineers in 1945 before being demolished. The specific physics of the V3, using sequential acceleration to bypass the limitations of conventional propellants, did not die in the chalk. These principles resurfaced decades later in the research into electromagnetic railguns. The US Navy's railgun prototypes, which underwent testing until their cancellation in 2022, relied on the same concept of sequential acceleration along a barrel length that the German engineer August Koenders proposed in 1944. The V3 was a mechanical dead end, but its ballistics theory was sound enough to seduce naval engineers 80 years later. In a warehouse in Maryland lies the WW2 V3, a jet-powered flying wing. Its alien shape, a tailless wing made of plywood, has fueled decades of conspiracy theories. In the fevered imagination of the post-war era, the sighting of such advanced German prototypes likely birthed the myths of Nazi UFOs or the Haunebu saucers. Academically, these myths crumble under scrutiny. The HO229 was not anti-gravity sorcery. It was a desperate attempt to reduce drag and save weight. When Northrop Grumman tested a replica for radar cross-section, they found it was indeed stealthy, but this was a byproduct of its shape, not intentional stealth technology. The charcoal in the glue was for bonding, not radar absorption. Yet the aerodynamic data from the HO229 validated Jack Northrop's flying wing theories, eventually culminating in the B-2 Spirit bomber. Not all wonder weapons were mechanical. Germany had amassed a terrifying stockpile of tabun and sarin nerve agents. The Allies were terrified of these stocks. They faced a dilemma. The weapons were too dangerous to move long distances and too dangerous to keep. The solution was a chaotic, clandestine disposal operation known as Operation Luster. The Allies loaded entire ships, the SS Empire Cormorant and SS Wairuna, with thousands of tons of chemical shells. They were sailed to the deep Atlantic and the Skagerrak and scuttled. The Soviets followed suit, dumping nearly 40,000 tons of chemical munitions into the Baltic Sea, particularly near the Bornholm Basin. This decision, made in the frantic fog of 1945, has curdled into a modern environmental crisis. The casings are finally corroding. As of 2025, the German government has been forced to allocate €100 million for emergency cleanup operations, deploying robotic submersibles to map the decay. Recent expeditions by the Geomar Helmholtz Center have confirmed that the arsenic and mustard gas are leaking into the sediment, creating toxic dead zones. Reports from Polish and Danish fisheries indicate a rise in burn catches, fish with chemical lesions, and lumps of coagulated mustard gas resembling amber washing up on tourist beaches. It is a slow-motion disaster, a lethal inheritance that refuses to stay buried. The Third Reich may have surrendered in May 1945, but its chemical arsenal is still fighting a war against the biology of the Baltic Sea. The wonder weapons did not save the Third Reich. They were symptoms of a chaotic procurement system that prioritized spectacular breakthroughs over reliable logistics. The V2 consumed more alcohol than the German army could spare for potatoes. The Me-262 burned fuel the Luftwaffe did not have. However, a distinct paradox remains. While these weapons failed militarily, they succeeded historically. The destruction of the Wehrmacht in 1945 did not mark the end of German military engineering, it marked its diffusion. The DNA of the Wehrmacht's arsenal was spliced into the military-industrial complexes of the Cold War superpowers. Every time a Scud missile launched in the Middle East, it was a V-2 flying again. Every time a jetliner crossed the Atlantic on swept wings, it rode on data harvested from Bavarian airfields. Every modern submarine that stalks the deep ocean uses hull forms drafted in the desperate winter of 1944. And in the silent depths of the Baltic, the chemical ghosts of the regime still wait in rusting shells. The physical weapons were scrapped, melted down, or placed in museums. But the ideas, the blueprints, the equations, and the engineering principles escaped the bunker. They did not vanish. They merely changed flags.